we get into our big stories this morning, and we're doubling down on Parliament. We're going to be looking at some emerging issues. 4 years on of having the private members bill. Has it served its purpose? What are the key takeaways? We're also going to be looking at that latest road or traffic LI, which has now been withdrawn. But what are the dynamics? And all these claims about I knew not, I didn't know, the Speaker of Parliament, and then the defense, initial defense from the minority side, and now the running away from it. What exactly happened? Another matter we're going to be contemplating this morning, that major shakeup in Parliament's committees and their structure. The minority is now chairing some committees. We're going to be interrogating what it means for our Parliament and democracy in general. Well, this morning we have our guests joining this all-important conversation. Dr. John Osai-Kwapong is a CDD fellow. We also have from the Parliamentary Network Africa, Sammy Obeng. Gentlemen, good morning to you.
Good morning to you, Benjamin.
Can I hear from Sammy Obeng? All right. We also have joining the conversation Alhassan Suini, who is going to be chairing one of those committees as well, and he joins us via phone. Honorable Suini, a very good morning to you.
Good morning, my brother, and good morning to my other panelists.
It's good to have you. I know
good
you're
morning,
on...
Ben.
Is that Sammy Obeng?
Yes, it is.
All right. Okay, so stay with me, Mr. Obeng. Thank you for joining the conversation. But Al-Hassan, since I hear you're pretty tied up this morning, I'm going to start with you. How do you react, first of all? We'll talk about the private members bill for starters. It's been 4 years. We know the history of this. Has it lived up to expectation, at least your expectation, this private members bill and what it has been used for, including the LGBTQI plus bill and some of those that have been cast away, set aside by the president because they put a strain, or they will likely put a strain on the consolidated fund. Your thoughts, Alhassan Suini?
Well, thank you very much, Ben, for this very, very important discussion that you are seeking to conduct this morning. I think one of the problems with our democracy is the level of appreciation people have, especially when it comes to the working of the different arms of government, say the judiciary, the executive, and then the legislature. I think that there is some level of, low appreciation of the responsibilities that are assigned and how those responsibilities are discharged. I mean, sometimes you can say, a higher understanding of the responsibilities imposed, but then there is little appreciation of how, those responsibilities can be discharged. So I think this is a very, very important conversation that you are seeking to have this morning. And I hope that people are going to be very candid and listeners are also going to be very open-minded and appreciate the issues as they are. On the subject of the, private members bill, I would say that, yes, it has lived up to expectation. Members of Parliament, since it was introduced, have shown some remarkable interest in taking up the opportunity to propose new legislation. In some cases, they have not met the constitutional provision, and so they do not even see the light of day. But the few that have actually met that constitutional requirement of not posing a charge on the consolidated fund have gone through the mill and the process of getting passed into law. And you see that within the period, we have had a number of private member bills, either considered and passed into law or pending the assent of His Excellency the President. So generally speaking, I think that there is still room for even more issues to be addressed by our parliamentarians. Because until, for example, the way I began, until this private members bill came about, it was very common for you, an MP, to be accosted on the street in your constituency and asked why you are not proposing to make law on one matter or the other. Why, as an MP, you are not leading to make law on one issue or the other. People did not even realize that by the nature of our governance architecture, bills usually emanated from the executive. And that I remember saying this on another platform. The discussion, I think it was on your platform, the discussion had to continue after when one colleague, Kofi Kapito, I will mention his name, called me and had issues with the way I put it, that Parliament does government business. For a very long time, Parliament always used to do government business. And so you have the private business, which is usually question time, statement time by members of Parliament, and that's considered private business. And that's what members of Parliament were, if you like, resigned to, which you could call their business. But any other thing in terms of passing law, passing budget, those were government businesses. And so this private members bill has given members the opportunity to also propose laws and legislation on how some of the issues that we face as a country can be dealt with by law. And I think that members of Parliament's attitude towards this new development has been impressive. The only dampener, I mean, the downside of this has been the president's attitude of late. It is the executive attitude of late that is seeking to put some impediments and some roadblocks and some, if you like, discouragement, when it comes to taking up the opportunity to propose bills and regulations that can help improve our governance architecture. I haven't been impressed at all with the way His Excellency the President, especially because of the flippant attitude towards the LGBTQ issue. He has extended it to even some other bills that he initially even assented to, and it is putting a dampener on it. But it is my hope that the attitude of the executive will change to encourage more members of Parliament to take up the responsibility of proposing legislation that will not necessarily impose cost on the consolidated fund, but will help improve our governance architecture better. So I think that it has lived up to expectation. The only downside is the attitude of the executive now.
Let me go to Samuel Beng. I want your take on that, because if you reflect on this, in other Commonwealth jurisdictions, this has been the norm. They have it entrenched in their constitutions. You can talk about Australia, New Zealand, the UK, Canada, India, Norway. You can even talk about Nigeria and Kenya right here in Africa. But in Ghana, though there are some provisions in our constitution that would have implied it, not necessarily enforced it. I'm talking about Articles 93 to 108, 22 to, and 1853. Then you have the obstacle that was posed by Article 108A of the Constitution in terms of enacting private members' bills. For 4 years, we've had this on our table. Has it served its purpose from where you sit, Samuel Beng?
Well, Ben, thank you. You are right. Yesterday was exactly 4 years since Parliament passed the resolution to start admitting private members' bills, 16th July 2020. This was during the period of the 7th Parliament. And so, as you may be aware, yesterday at Parliamentary Network Africa, we held a public forum to commemorate 4 years of private members' bill that had the Right Honourable Speaker speaking at the event together with the Deputy Attorney General and Honourable Susu and members of academia on the panel. Now, during this 4-year period, there's been a lot of interesting happenings within the space, and it will interest your viewers to note that over the period, apart from the first private members bill that passed during the period of the 7th Parliament. And that was sometime in December of 2020 before Parliament went, that Parliament was dissolved, which was the Road Traffic Amendment Bill as a private members bill. In this new Parliament, there's been 24 legislative drafting instructions, which means that 24 ideas for private members' bills have actually been brought up by members of Parliament, out of which 10 have been completed and presented to Parliament and referred to various committees, and 5 have been passed. These 5 do not have, all of them have not been accented to by the president, and we know the backstory to that. But we've had some that have already been accented to by the president. The private members bill that is decriminalizing attempted suicide has been accented to by the president. The private members bill, there were 2 private members bills on abolition of death penalty. One has been accented to by the president, the other has not. Of course, these 2 are very related. So to have the president sign one and say, I'm not signing the other, because of X and Y reasons, was also a very interesting angle. The witchcraft one has not been signed to by the president. The other one on abolition of death penalty, criminal offences amendment, the Armed Forces Amendment Bill has not been signed by the president. And then, of course, the Proper Human Sexual Rights and Family Value as bill. So these are the statistics when it comes to private members bill. What this means is that if in 4 years we've had members of Parliament who for over 30 years could not propose private members legislation because people had a very narrow reading of what Article 108 portends for legislators making laws, and yet in 4 years have been able to have 24 legislative drafting instructions. That is a very, very, very positive thing. I recall that prior to this starting, a lot of us were asking the questions around whether the structures were in place, whether Parliament had the right drafting offices and staffers to be able to support members of Parliament to do this. In 2020, when we're discussing the 2019-2020, some of us were quite skeptical. But Parliament have shown that they have, at least when...
Hello, Sammy Obeng.
Parliament has shown that when push comes to shove, they have what it takes to be able to put in place the right measures to kick this off. So it has started brilliantly. Members of Parliament have embraced it. Of course, some members of Parliament have embraced it more than others. But just like any legislative practice, you don't expect all members of Parliament to be champions at everything. There will be some who will be private members bill enthusiasts. There will be some who will be committee experts. There will be some who will do many other things. And so it's been great so far. There's been some obstacles indeed. Yesterday brought up a number of them during the public forum that was held in partnership with the University of Ghana Parliament House. Incidentally, that was also where the speaker spoke about the LI and he not knowing about, but we'll come to that particular subject matter later. But general assessment is that it's been a great 4 years. It's been fraught with challenges, but I consider these challenges as challenges that, when surmounted, can help strengthen the parliamentary practice and our processes around private members legislation, including the issues in court. Hopefully, once these things are settled, it will even make the regime stronger.
I will come back to you later on Article 108A of our Constitution and how it sits with the private members bill, structure that we've now adopted. But let me go to Dr. John Osai-Kwapong. For you, what is your position on this matter? You've seen a plethora of them, like Samuel Bing has rightly pointed out, some of which in recent times have been jettisoned by the executive because of purported, draws on the consolidated purse or fund. Your thinking is what?
Yeah, thank you very much, Benjamin. And thank you very much to Mr. Samuel Bing, because I wasn't even aware of the flurry of activities that have emerged as a result of this private members bill. I think I was aware of maybe just a couple of them, especially the proper human sexual rights, etc. legislation, because that gained quite a lot of media attention and a lot of engagement in our public spaces. So it's quite informative to know that there's been at least about 24 that ideas that have come up as a result of this, some of which has made its way to various committees, some of which has made its way to Parliament, some which has been passed but accented to, yet to be accented to, etc., etc. But I think it is one of those things that will take time. I think ultimately what you want to see is you want to see a lot of these ideas make its way all the way to getting the assent of the president so that it becomes law. That is the primary duty of our legislators, right? To help make law. It's interesting. I've always found it instructive that our setup, and as Sami said, the narrow reading of that constitutional provision has made it in such a way that most of our legislation always sort of emerges, from the executive side of the house. So I think it's good to see that progress is being made. I'm hoping that as time goes on, we'll see a lot of legislative activity emanating from Parliament, and hopefully we get to see a lot of private member bills that actually become law because it gets the president's assent.
Thank you for those initial thoughts. Let me go back to Alhassan Suini. What do you feel? There's nothing that is perfect. What do you feel have been the drawbacks, or at least the major takeaways from the use of this private members bill that you'd like to share with us, you being a legislator, having foreknowledge of this?
Well, first of all, it is the issue I related to earlier, and that has to do with the attitude of the executive. I mean, when so much effort is put in by members of Parliament, drafting, consideration stage is a lot of work. And you have a number of stages that these bills will go through: first reading, second reading, third reading, and eventually pass and forwarded to the president. And he, it's, like I said, flippant towards, the issues. It discourages members of Parliament who otherwise would have also liked to explore new ideas and propose legislation in that regard. So my first drawback is the recent attitude of the executive towards these private members' bills that have been considered and passed by Parliament. The other issue remains how to circumvent the requirement of Article 108.8 of the 1992 Constitution. I mean, it's so difficult. I have been part of a number of these private members' bills, the draft stage and the consideration stage. And sometimes, given an overstretch, it is almost impossible for any bill, strictly speaking, to be said, or any law, strictly speaking, one part, to be said to have no consequences on the consolidated fund. After all, the implementation of every law will always require, the police service or the agencies tasked with the responsibility of implementing that law to do so. And those agencies or institutions that are to implement that law obviously draws from the consolidated fund to do that. So, I mean, circumventing the provisions of Article 108 has remained a stumbling block, when it comes to the consideration of these private members' bills. I also think that human resource in Parliament has also been a challenge. I mean, sometimes you may have the idea of a member of Parliament, but you do not have the legal education on how to draft, these laws. And depending on the parliamentary service, in some cases, haven't proven adequate. And so you may have to get some experts, drafters outside Parliament to help. If you, as a private member, you are minded to propose a bill to, regulate any issue in the country. Again, it's an expensive enterprise. It's an expensive enterprise. And there's nothing in the parliamentary architecture, be it conditions of service, that takes care of the expenses that a member may incur trying to put a private member's bill together. And definitely, putting this together, you need to engage with stakeholders. You will have to organize meetings. Like I said, you will need drafters to help you with it. So it is very difficult to finish proposing and, shepherding a private member's bill through Parliament without incurring some costs on you as a member of Parliament. And there is nothing in the conditions of service of Parliament that, caters for that kind of expenditure. And so these are some of the things on the top of my head that I can say serve as drawbacks or roadblocks as far as the opportunity to propose and pass private members' bill is concerned. But generally speaking, I want to reiterate the point I made, and I think that the statistics provided by Samuel Obeng actually confirms the point that this has been very well received and promoted by members of Parliament, and it will become better if we get some if you like commiserate response and attitude from the executive towards the idea of private members' bill.
Okay. Let me just situate the conversation from here. Since we've been talking about the private members' bill, I want us to take them apart one by one, compartmentalize them. 108A of our Constitution says, Parliament shall not, unless the bill is introduced or the motion is introduced by or on behalf of the President, A, proceed upon a bill including an amendment to a bill that, in the opinion of the person presiding, makes provision for any of the following. And I'll just quickly walk through them. 1, the imposition of taxation or the alteration of taxation otherwise than by reduction. Or 2, the imposition of a charge on the consolidated fund which has been used, or other public funds of Ghana on the alteration of any such charge otherwise than by reduction. Or 3, the payment, issue, or withdrawal from the consolidated fund or other public funds of Ghana of any money not charged on the consolidated fund or any increase in the amount of that payment, issue, or withdrawal. Or 4, the composition or remission of any debt due to the government of Ghana. And then it gets into B. Al-Hassan, I'll start with you briefly this time. You see where the problem has emerged with the presidency, the executive, on some of the latest private members' bills. What do you feel would be the cure for this? You started getting into that, but I want from your end, what do you think will be a clear cure for this per the Constitution?
I think it has to do with a matter that I have always raised, the attitude and the character of the people that we put in office. Because clearly, it is matter, or how do they say it, substance over form. It is in the end, if you want to overstretch it, if you want to overstretch the provisions of Article 108A, as an executive, as the leader of the executive, you will have an argument against any private member's bill that is, passed into law. And based on that, decide not to attend to it. But if you are minded and you have the character to overlook, whatever imaginary or, if like stretch cost that the implementation of that law will have on the consolidated fund, you will be more susceptible to assenting to that law. So I think that it has to do with the character and the attitude of the people we put in authority. And it is a point I have made when it comes to calls on the need to revise our Constitution. I agree that after using the Constitution for so many years, there are justifiable calls for us to revise the Constitution.
Is this one of the things that ought to be revised in our Constitution, Article 108A?
Yes, yes. Perhaps if we undertake that revision, we can look at how we can limit the discretion that is available to an executive president in terms of how a private member's bill can be interpreted to either be against or in line with the provisions of Article 1088. Maybe a revision of the Constitution can help us properly, refine Article 1088 in such a way that it can contain this new idea of allowing members of parliament to come up with, to propose legislation and to get parliament to pass them into laws. And maybe it can also impose a certain strict responsibility on the executive to assent to these bills, despite whatever reservations, personal or not, that they may have against the bills that come out. So it is, as things stand now, in my view, the attitude and character of the leadership, that, or the people who lead the executive, that can encourage members of parliament to continue to take advantage of this new idea to propose new legislation. But moving forward, perhaps the way to cure it will be during constitutional review. We look at how we can situate Article 1088 within the context of our desire to get more members of parliament to propose legislation.
In light of that, and I'm posing that same question to the rest of you, 108A, which I have read, how does that situate the private members bill in terms of legality, in terms of our 1992 Constitution? And do you feel 108A, Article 108A, ought to be revised to reflect the times? Samuel Bey.
Well, it is important to note that we have come quite far when it comes to some of these issues. It's important to note that we have come quite far when it comes to some of these issues. Remember that we had gone through an era where the interpretation of some of these constitutional provisions was that to the extent that Parliament will sit and have electricity on and papers will be written on and parliamentarians will go into committees and what have you, would be a cost on the public purse, and for which reason, people stretched the constitutional provisions to mean that no private members' bill at all could come up. To that level where 4 years ago, Parliament passed the resolution, and we agree 100% at Parliamentary Network Africa with Parliament on that particular position. As you may be aware, at Parliamentary Network Africa, one of the major initiatives we run is to have a private members' bills desk that tracks, matters relating to private members' bills and also works with civil society organizations and other stakeholders on how we can use this route, to ensure that the gaps within our legislation, we can work with members of parliament to get things going. Now, so we have come far, right, to where we are now. We also know that there are many provisions in our constitution as a country, which, but for issues being taken up in courts, the courts ruling on it and providing clarity, especially at the apex court of the land, there was so much ambiguity around some of the issues, at least from our layman's perspectives, and so that's why I find whatever is happening as something that helps to improve the practices and procedures, to improve the understanding of these issues and to strengthen the situation. And that is why we have always maintained that the Supreme Court, when these matters come up, must see it as a good opportunity to make determinations that have long-term effects, because these determinations have long-term effects, and that when these determinations are made and are made right as we expect them to always do, it helps to clarify things for us. So we may not necessarily have constitutional reviews anytime soon. We've seen the trajectory of our constitutional review process, but at least the court helps us to clarify on some of these matters. We are of the opinion, really, that the Constitution, although did not expressly state the private members' bill arrangement, many portions of the Constitution actually makes room for members of parliament to pass bills through private members' legislation. The Constitution is very clear that the lawmaking powers, of the country rest with the Parliament of Ghana. Constitutions of old, from our first Republican Constitution right up till now, has always had these kinds of provisions in there. Although those previous times did not actually see the culture of private members' bills, emanate so strongly. So we have come very far. And for me, just like any other issue of constitutionality, any other issue of nation building, these phases helps to strengthen them. I think that the concentration should be more on building the systems that allows for some of these things to thrive. Honorable Suhuyini mentioned a number of the challenges that are faced by members of parliament in doing this, and we can relate with those challenges clearly. In fact, when it started, one of the biggest challenges was that there was no legal drafting office in parliament at all, that could support members of parliament on this. Now there is, of course, the human resource there are limited, but it's better than it was. And they are doing some amazing, amazing work. We've been working with them very closely, and they do some fantastic work, in there. But of course, they are also challenged. They would have wished that members of parliament also had support systems by way of research that could help ensure that the kind of legislative ideas that they bring are fine-tuned a bit so that the workload on the legislative drafting office will be relatively limited. But that is not so, because of human resource issues. Major challenge is also the issue of the finances that Honorable Suhuyini mentioned. It's so expensive. When it's a bill emanating from the executive branch, there is always an agency that is championing this. So there is resources for committee engagement. There is resources for public participation. There is resources for research and what have you. But in this case, it looks like if you're a member of parliament and you're bringing this up, then it is all on you, because parliament have not been able to set aside a dedicated fund for some of these things, and so the likes of Honorable Sosu, who have done some amazing work, and it is worth noting that more than half of all of these legislative ideas have come from him. By the way, legislative drafting ideas have come from him, by the way, and many of the ones that have already passed are ones that he, together with a few other MPs, have championed. Now, if you don't have the resources, then it becomes challenging, and we as civil society at some point have had to help support members of parliament in this regard. But it is a system that has come to stay. It is very positive. It is very useful. In fact, for many of the private members' bills that do not even get to pass or do not even get through, the mere fact that it gets announced had actually caused some transformations in our systems, which means that it becomes a very useful tool for advocacy. Let me give you an example. When it was announced that Parliament would want to use the private members' bill route to cause the reduction in the taxes on sanitary pads, we saw that in the budget that followed, something got done. And there are two other examples, and so for us as civil society, we also see it as a tool for advocacy. You don't always have to have a bill passed. If you can have a legislative idea that when pushed through the system can cause the changes that you're actually looking forward to, why not? If, for example, the idea to have a private members bill that would stop government officials from buying state assets leads to government making a determination conclusively that we are not going to actually have this sold to anybody, who is actually a member of government. That would be a win. Of course, if you back it with legislation, it even makes it relatively better. So for me, I really don't think that we should be majoring too much on the constitutional issues, especially when the courts are seized with it at the moment. I think that a lot of these determinations will be made, but we should build the foundations, the building blocks, and there should not be any attitude that seeks to suggest that we do not want the private members' bill regime to flourish or to progress.
Okay. Let me come to you, Dr. John Osai-Kweapong, briefly on that, and then we'll move on to the traffic LI, and then also look at the shake-up in Parliament. But your opinion on that before we segue.
Yeah, so I've always been curious as to why those provisions, right? Because Parliament has the lawmaking powers given to it in the Constitution. Parliament also, if you think of government expenditures, right? If you think of the budget, all of those things, it still has to go through Parliament. So it's kind of curious that the body that has to approve how we spend or do not spend money, how we contract or do not contract, international loans, is the same body that the Constitution seemed to have placed an impediment in their way when it comes to a private member's bill with that provision of it can't sort of have a charge on the consolidated fund, etc., etc. But again, hopefully with time, whether it's through practice, conventions, at some point, if we may need a constitutional interpretation, from the court. Hopefully it can cure some of these challenges in the way of members of parliament so that you can encourage them to do a lot more of private member bills.
All right. Let me now start with you on the LI, the traffic LI, which has now been withdrawn based on the fallout, public fallout. And of interest is the fact that in recent times, like the SNIT deal, like this one, there's been a hue and cry, and then there is some reaction. Some have said it is because elections are close by. But this LI was late. It appeared initially that both the minority and the majority were in consonance on it. They were at Edem. Then all of a sudden, I mean, we heard from the likes of Roxanne Nelson, Dafia Mekpo on that matter. We heard from other minority MPs. We also heard from Andy Appiah Kubi as well, saying, we need this. Then all of a sudden, there was a pirouette, an about turn by the minority. The speaker, interestingly, said he was not in the know. And that has left a lot of us scratching our heads like, what is your take on that LI, its relevance or otherwise, and the parliamentary process? And now the minority completely stepping aside and saying, we did not know about this. We're not in support of it, contrary to some of what we know. Dr. John Osai-Kwapong.
It was a kind of an odd LI. I was not sure the problem that it was trying to cure or address. I mean, except for the fact that, yes, we all know that staying in traffic for long hours can be, irritating. I mean, we all go through the commuting hours of either the morning or the evening, and we all wish sometimes we don't have to stay in traffic. We all wish that traffic would flow seamlessly, etc., etc. But I just found it a little curious that as a result of those irritations, if that was the motivation for this LI, that there was the idea that will allow them to use sirens, go above the speed limit, etc., etc. As Professor Kwesi Prempeh said, apart from the president and the vice president, he struggles, and I share that opinion, to see why anybody else would want that privilege. I also feel like, as a result of the public commentary and the public disapproval of that idea, may have resulted in overall the LI being withdrawn or discontinued, but probably may also have informed some of the about 10 position that we witnessed. But it's also, for me, a good illustration of the fact that, yes, it may be an election year, but maybe one of the things that as citizens we need to do more of is, using our voices to disapprove of some of maybe the actions or ideas or thoughts that may emerge, whether it's from the executive or from Parliament. Yes, they may go ahead with certain things, even with a whole lot of public hue and cry. But I believe that there are also some occasions where they may listen. And hopefully, if we do a lot more of that from the citizens' end, that we may be able to get to a place someday where there is public sensitivity to the actions of our lawmakers, our policymakers, those who implement policies and programs on our behalf. If you look at the most recent Afrobarometer, for example, there's a perception that there's a question about how often do you think members of parliament listen to what ordinary folks have to say, and the percentages are quite low. So there's this perception that our members of parliament do not listen very often to what ordinary people have to say. But hopefully, if we do a lot more of that and see some of these discontinuation of ideas, or even an ally that had made its way that far, that hopefully you can get a more or an improved parliament that is sensitive to public sentiment.
Samuel Bing, are parliamentarians, and by extension, broader leadership, the executive, legislature, judiciary, taking us for granted? And this is why. If you look at that communication from the Office of the President, dated the 19th of May, 2021, it is titled Abuse of the Use of Sirens by Ministers and Other Government Officials. It clarifies in there on LI 2180, Regulation 74, that the only ones allowed to use these sirens or bells are, reinforcing it, a government vehicle used by the head of state, a police vehicle, a motor vehicle used by the fire service, motor vehicle used as an ambulance or a hospital or clinic, and then a motor vehicle used by a recognized government security agencies, and bullion vehicles. Then it specifies that those not to use it, honorable ministers and deputy ministers, regional ministers and deputy regional ministers, MMDAs or MMDCEs, I should say, then CEOs of government agencies and officials of the presidency, unless otherwise designated. That was clear from that point. But then you also take a look at the disparities, because it has been pointed out that the bill, as was laid before Parliament, versus the bill submitted to the committee for assessment were different. If you look at 39, 40, Article 39 and 40, you would realize that there are some disparities, purportedly. What do you make of it from the first angle of whether our leaders are taking us for granted based on what the communication was in 2021 and these disparities and their usefulness or otherwise? Samuel Bey.
Well, first of all, we've got to be active citizens. It is through being active citizens that we get some results, like the kinds of results that has been chalked in recent times. Because the reason why even checks and balances are embedded in the governance system for even the arms of government is that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And if you allow people the opportunity to...
Hello, Samuel Bing.
If you allow people to go the way they want to go, the fact that we are human would usually lead us to, deciding on things in a particular manner that usually does not inure to the general
Samuel Bing, I'm losing your sound. I'm losing your sound. Can we try again?
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you. I lost you for about 5 seconds. I lost you for about 5 seconds.
Okay. All right. So the point the further point I was making is that it's important to note that this came through as a result of a legislative instrument, LI, subsidiary legislation, rather than a bill. Now, one of the challenges that we have always had is the opacity of the subsidiary legislative systems that we have in our parliamentary practices, and of course, constitutionally provided. If it is a bill, what it means is that if the Speaker refers it to the committee will have to engage with the public, expect public opinion and all of that. Public participation is very active. In the case of subsidiary legislations, LIs, Parliament can do all of these things because there is a mother bill and they're having a subsidiary legislation for that mother bill without consulting anybody. And we wouldn't have known some of these matters but for some level of vigilance. And the subsidiary legislative committee is not mandated, really, because of the nature of subsidiary legislation, to invite anybody, really, from the public or invite public opinion, because within 21 sitting days, if there are no objections from the committee and from Parliament at large, the subsidiary legislation is deemed to have been passed. And so we see so many instances of fantastic bills that have been passed to act in developing subsidiary legislation, standing on the back of some lacunas that may have been identified in those acts, and then making some far-reaching provisions that could be very harmful, particularly for this situation. Look, once I heard it, this was the very first thing that jumped at me. His Excellency the President, His Excellency the Vice President usually are driven by, professional security folks who are as drivers who are trained for this and what have you. Members of parliament are not provided drivers by parliament or any other state security institution. In fact, a member of parliament can drive himself or can hire his brother to drive him, or his wife can be driving him as his driver, and he gets to pay the person. Are we saying that if the honorable member of parliament is driving himself, or his wife is driving him, or whatever, his driver who may probably not have been, may probably not be as excellent a driver as anybody else, then will not have speed limits, then will not have, to observe the rules that we all have to observe on the roads? How dangerous can this be? Right? And so the opacity of legislative instruments, subsidiary legislations that comes to parliament, and the processes that does not allow for effective public participation is what is leading to things like this. And I think that all of us, from civil society to media to members of the public, must start zooming our lenses a lot on allies when presented, on subsidiary legislation when presented to parliament, just like we do on some of the bills that are of interest to us, because without which we would have had 275 risk-prone vehicles zooming across our streets, country, section to section, with no limits. You can imagine how dangerous that could be.
I see. Well, interesting thoughts. Gentlemen, let's cap it off on the shake-up in Parliament and the different parties that have now taken over finance, among others. Let me just walk you through some of them as I have them here. So we know, for example, that Kweku Kwarteng is said to have rejected that new role as ranking on the Economy Committee, chaired by an NDC MP. And the ranking on that committee now being Amapoma Boateng as put forward. Then Mines and Energy, now only the Energy Committee with no responsibility for mines, which will now be taken care of by the Committee on Lands and Natural Resources. The ranking on that committee is now Al-Hassan Suini. We spoke to him a short while earlier. Then you have Samuel Okujeto Ablakwa, chairman of the Government Assurance Committee. He used to be ranking on the Foreign Affairs Committee, as we know, and the ranking there on the Foreign Affairs Committee is now Dr. Abdul Rashid Pelpu. It goes on and on. I'll start with you, Samuel Bing. The shake-up, the relevance of the shake-up at this time in the dying embers of the 8th Parliament. How do you relate to it?
Well, first of all, it is important. Can you hear me?
I can hear you. Please go ahead.
Right. First of all, it is important to note that this has come about as a result of the changes to the standing orders of Parliament, right? Parliament adopted new standing orders at the dying embers of last year, and from the beginning of this year, they've been applying these new standing orders. These standing orders require some changes to committees, the nomenclature of the committee, the functions of the committee, but also to
Samuel Bing?
And also to the issues around how many members of parliament make up each one of these committees. And so naturally, it was expected that the Committee on Selection, which is the committee that chaired by the Right Honourable Speaker, by the Standing Orders of Parliament, that is responsible for getting the two sides to agree on who and who becomes members from their respective caucuses being on committees, get to do their work and announce new committees. So the timing, yes, it's quite interesting, but it's a requirement from the new standing orders, right? That's the first point. The second point is that these new committee arrangements is also very progressive. In fact, it is in line with modern trends so far as parliamentary practice and parliamentary work is concerned. What do I mean by that? We had an instance in the past where only the subsidiary legislation committee, public accounts committee, chaired by the minority in parliament, or the party that does not form the government, in parliament. The rest are all chaired by parties that are forming government. And we've noticed from parliamentary practice the world over that this is not very healthy. for purpose of oversight, for purpose of accountability, for purpose of transparency. And so Parliament of Ghana has transformed this greatly and has introduced instances where there are specific committees that will be chaired by the party that forms the government for very good reason. Committees that are dealing with issues of national security you will understand why committees that are dealing with national security, foreign affairs, and co will be chaired by the party in government. But you'll also understand why committees like the ones that are dealing with government assurances, subsidiary legislation, public accounts committee, and the likes will be compulsorily chaired by the party or the caucus that is not forming government. And then the rest of them will be shared among the caucuses, majority, minority, in equal number or number proportionate to the numbers that they have in Parliament. So with this hang, you're almost having a 50-50 situation of committees chaired in Parliament. So that's also a very good thing. So these are the backgrounds to why this has happened. And now, of course, the numbers have also reduced. You had committees that had almost 30 members, 24, 27. It made work very, very difficult. Now it's been reduced by way of how many members can make up a committee, but also the number of committees generally have gone up because some committees were too large. They needed to be split and all of you. Some of the names that have come up and some of the fallouts, rather, for me, are the interesting aspects of this. A few weeks ago, I had indicated, in one of the comments I had sent to some Sense News File program, how people like the Honorable Party as Finance Committee Chair must be protected by all of us by using our voices. Because if you saw the work that the committee was doing, and sometimes not all of these things came out in the public domain, because yes, you can understand why, for political reasons, some of these things must be dealt with internally. How a committee that is chaired by a member of parliament who is in the majority in the ruling party blocks tax exemptions because he, as chairman, together with his other members, thinks that this is not in the best interest of the nation, right? And ask the ministry to take these things back, many of them, right? Of course, you don't expect people to be very happy with these things. And for us, this is the backstory, really, for taking people like Wekukwati out of a committee of finance and saying that he's going to, work in economy. I would have been surprised if he had accepted that, by the way. You get the point.
So from what you said, it was right for him to reject it.
Sorry?
So from what you said, it was right for him to reject it.
Oh, absolutely. Look, we must start getting to the point where committee membership, leadership on committees does not become a tool in the hands of the leadership of caucuses to either punish people or reward people who they think are loyalists, not in the overall national interest. And we must start speaking out on things like this, in my opinion. Of course, one of the very exciting things that has happened with this shakeup is having Mr. Kujetua Blakwa as chairperson of Committee on Government Assurances. We've realized how that particular committee, depending on who is leading it, can be a very useful tool or a very useless committee, and we've seen how useless it could be, in some recent past. And so, we would expect a lot from that particular committee, although it will be short-lived. They just have about 6 months, but to be able to make sure that the promises that government makes on the floor of parliament, the promises that parliamentary officials make on the floor of parliament, somebody or a committee is holding them accountable to the timelines, the deadlines, and making sure that they are living up to those expectations is also very exciting. But this entire shakeup was expected to happen because of the changes in the standing orders.
Right. Dr. John Osai-Kwapong, your take on that would be the shakeup, and that's how we're going to end.
Yeah, so I recall that when the changes to the standing orders
and Dr. John Osai-Kwapong, please hold for me. Let me let go of Samuel Bing. I know you have to move on to other things. Thank you so much for your time. We're grateful, and I wish you the best.
My pleasure always.
Right. That is Samuel Bing. He's with the Parliamentary Network Africa. Back to you, Dr. Osai-Kwapong.
Thank you very much. So I recall last year when the proposed changes to the standing orders was made public, I was very excited about it because I think we often hear this public narrative that We have a very strong executive. Parliament is weak. Parliament doesn't really check the executive as much as it can. And my counter argument was always that the executive is only as strong as Parliament makes it, right? That if Parliament would flex its muscles sometimes, that it could really, improve its oversight. So for me, the first thing for me is the prospect of greater oversight that I see. Because again, and I always go back to Afrobarometer, but if you go to Afrobarometer, you see the sentiment of Ghanaians implicitly wanting greater oversight of the executive. For example, in 2012, only 8% felt or perceived that the president often or always ignores Parliament. And then it's grown to 33% in the most recent Afrobarometer, right? So if you look at some of the committees that are now going to be chaired by the minority party in this or subsequent parliament, at least you can have some assurance that oversight of the executive will be improved. I also think that you are going to see a much stronger hand given to the minority party in the conduct of the affairs of Parliament. Again, we often tend to say that the minority would have its say, but the majority would have its way. But with some of these reconfigurations, I think it will be more than just the minority having its say, but the minority would have an impactful say in the affairs, of Parliament as it works with its majority counterpart. So for me, the prospect of the greater oversight and then the prospect of a stronger hand of minority in the conduct of parliamentary affairs beyond even just this Parliament, I think it's good. Public perceptions of Parliament is not the best. If you look at the most recent Afrobarometer, it's one of the institutions with the lowest approval rating when it comes to performance. And then lowest, the perceptions of corruption is not great. Trust is low as well. So hopefully this shakeup, as time progresses, would help improve how Ghanaian citizens have come to perceive the Parliament as an institution. Real quick, the one challenge, though, that I foresee would always be, the issue of partisanship. When the hand of the minority is strengthened, I think one of the things that you have to keep in mind is that in their eagerness to hold the executive accountable, which is from a different political party, that there is not an overreach, right? You have to walk that fine line between holding the executive accountable, ensuring greater oversight, and not overreaching in such a way that it can potentially cause political gridlock. Because once the majority starts to sense that on some of these committees that are now being chaired by members of the minority, and they sense that overreach, they may want to then also shield, their party or the executive that is, formed by its party, and that can cause, further political gridlock. But overall, I think it is good for the institution. It would strengthen Parliament, and my hope is that it would improve public perceptions of the work that Parliament does.
Conversation with you, and we'll also be joined by our next guest, and it has to do with the lithium agreement, its exploration in Ghana. The minority again adopting a stance on this matter. We'll be getting into the intricacies of that, but let me also announce that we have joining the conversation Dr. Steve Manteau. He is co-chair Ghana Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative. Dr. Manteau, good morning to you, sir.
Good morning, and my warm regards to your viewers and listeners.
All right. So we also have Dr. John Osai-Kwapong joining the conversation. I will now look to introduce our next guest as well on this beat. I'll get back to that shortly. But let me start with you, Dr. Steve Manteo, on this development. Lithium exploration in Ghana. That has been the latest matter that Parliament has been sharing its thoughts, its concerns on. But for you, the antecedents that have come to the fore before this, are we ready for this as it is now in Parliament? What is your take?
Well, we better be ready because research continues to focus attention on alternatives to lithium and other rare earth minerals that can be used for the purposes of manufacturing power storage facilities are quite intense these days. And so if we don't hurry up, our lithium will become worthless.
And I get the point you're making. Some have said that, I mean, the prices of lithium are falling already. And if you hold on to it for too long, you may get nothing out of it in the end. Exactly. Let me also, were you saying something, Dr. Manteo?
No, I was just endorsing the point you made about falling prices, which for me becomes the reason why we should not be too sentimental about discussions around lithium. Let me be quick to add, though, that Zimbabwe is Africa's leading producer of lithium. And the value of its annual production is about $250 million. Ghana is Africa's leading producer of gold. In a year, our gold enters in excess of $1 billion, sometimes $2 billion. Now, question you are asking yourself, in terms of value, where would you want to focus more attention? You want to focus more attention on the mineral that has a lot of value.
Right.
And yet, gold producers in this country only pay 5% for their royalty. They pay just 5%. In fact, some pay 3%. So it means that we are not getting enough from our gold, which is more valuable than the lithium. And so if somebody goes to negotiate twice the fiscal term for lithium, and the law becomes the basis for comparing whether we have a good deal or not, I would say we do have a good deal, because if you look at the fiscal terms in Act 703, we've gone over and above all of them. And for me, if we don't think we have a good deal, then we must change the law, because the law stipulates far, far less than we got from this lithium deal.
Right. Dr. Manteo, thanks for those initial thoughts. Let me also bring into the conversation Professor David Dodu Ahen. He is Director, Institute of Applied Science and Technology at the University of Ghana. Prof, good morning.
Good morning.
It's good to have you.
Good morning to our listeners.
Right.
Yes, thank you very much.
Your initial take on Ghana exploring lithium before we delve into the parliamentary process and what has happened so far. What's your take?
I believe this is very important part of our natural resource that we are exploring, and it is good for the country, especially when we are looking at the renewables and looking at energy storage systems and looking at electric vehicles, which is the backbone. Lithium is one of the greatest minerals that is powering this transition into electric vehicles. When we take electric vehicles, we are looking at the batteries that make these ones very possible. So once we have such a resource that we can make use in-house, I think this is really good for the country, and we should really look at it and exploit it and take very good advantage of it. Possibly we can even become a hub for battery research and for battery production across the sub-region.
For you, Dr. Osai Kwapong, your take would be, before we delve into Parliament?
Yes. So again, I think every country should explore and maximize, use of its, resource endowment. And so if lithium can be put to the overall benefit of Ghana And if it would help us move the development needle forward, then sure. But again, it always boils down, for me, it always boils down to, it's not a question of whether you have or do not have the resource. It's the policies and the practices and the choices that you make around these resources that ultimately would be beneficial to your country or not.
Let me come back to Dr. Steve Manteyao. Then you go to Parliament and you have the wranglings that we have seen. The minority has sort of, they've issued a pirouette of sorts. They've turned around in a way, now saying that, listen, even the committee to examine this must be looked at. And some suggest that they may be pussyfooting on moving forward with this deal. What do you make of the positioning of the minority on this matter?
Well, I think it's important to point out that Parliament is within its right to scrutinize the documents before the House, and it must not be stampeded. The minority are within their right to raise questions and concerns and to look at the best way to proceed with the transaction. So I have no qualms about parliamentary processes and the debate ongoing in Parliament around the deal. I think it tells me that at least Parliament is not acting like a rubber stamp. So if there are concerns, let's raise them. But let us not be too sentimental about the negotiated terms of the contract. I think it's not even gone into the terms. And so it's just the procedural issues they are addressing at this moment. I think it's within its right at the House to do that.
Now, those procedural issues, if I may just take a bit of them, you would see the Minority Chief Whip, Governs Kwame Agboja, talk about the fact that they are going to make the necessary references. They would not be rushed. They don't want to be railroaded by the majority. And he says, for example, Mr. Speaker, and I'm quoting him here, there is nothing in our standing orders today that will stop us from allowing them to leave. But be assured, you will not be allowed to control anybody to lay a legitimate agreement for anyone to go and mine in a reserved forest. Even if you give us 10 trillion, we don't care. You will be forced to do the right thing and make sure the environment is protected, not for you and I only, or better still, you and me only, but for the future generations yet unborn. So we are not going to stand in the way of laying it, but the committee that this will be referred to, Mr. Speaker, we are just about to approve the new committee under the new standing order. People have been attempting for this to be referred to a joint committee. You talk about the processes and procedures of Parliament. Does this sit right with you, the point that is being made, especially considering the ravages of Galamsey and what they are pointing to here, mining in reserved forests?
Yeah, they do fit pretty well with me. I must say that the work of Parliament is to safeguard the national interest in transactions of this nature. And so all the issues they raise in terms of environmental protection, picking the best value for Ghana and all that, I think things that resonate pretty well with me. I've always made a point that, look, we are having to explore and exploit for lithium and other critical minerals because of energy transition, which has been brought on by climate change. But this fact in itself runs counterproductive to the fight against climate change because, look, the search for renewable minerals will lead to intensification of mining. Look at Mankasim, a place that prior to this discovery had never been known to mining. Is now going to be opened up and all the topsoil taken off in order to extract the lithium. We need to be very careful how we go about this. And so the environmental safeguard that the Honorable raises, for me, sounds pretty well, that we need to be focused and we need to ensure that we do not take the resource at all costs. It does not mean that we should not take the resource. We can take the resource and we should take it, but let's ensure that we take it in a manner that does not harm the environment.
For you, Prof, is this grounded in proper reasoning, especially when you consider the bit about forest reserves, but also the angle raised by Governor Kwame Agboja that let's not refer it to what is now the erstwhile Committee on Mines and Energy. That no longer exists. It's now been separated. How does that sit with you?
Yeah, I think it's good to have a more sharper focus on our natural resources and how we manage these. Look, all over the world, every country develops on the basis of its resource, be it the human resource, be it the natural resource of that country. Ours is natural resources, but because we commingled it with other issues like energy and the rest, doesn't give us a very good focus. Now, if you have a committee that focuses exclusively on natural resources, then I expect much more from that committee. And I think that at the time, we can use this as a test case for how good a job that committee does on the ratification of this particular lithium agreement.
Dr. Saikwapo?
Yes, so as Dr. Mantiel said, Parliament is within its rights to scrutinize such agreements. I believe that the process and the scrutiny that comes with the process is just to ensure that whatever deal or whatever agreement is being made ultimately will serve the best interest of the country. But at the same time, you also want to make sure that the legitimacy of some of the concerns that are being raised does not sort of cross over into the point I was making earlier on about the shake-up in Parliament, which is you don't want minority concerns in as legitimate as they are to cross over into becoming, quote unquote, a stumbling block, right? You don't want the process to be used in such a way that it doesn't allow the smooth process to go on. But again, ultimately, you just hope that some of the process would be done in such a way that whatever concerns are raised would be addressed, because ultimately you do want a deal that serves the best interest of the country.
You do want a deal that serves the best interest of the country. But staying with you, Dr. Saikwapo, how then do we ensure, because we've seen a bit of a trend, right? How do we ensure the opposition does not use these new changes to obstruct government business for political gain? And that's a question I'll pose to all three of you, because we know how the politics is played in our country. How then do we ensure that the minority is just looking at our interests, the national interests, rather than maybe political interests, because it is the season of politics?
Yeah, I think one of the things that the minority would have to keep an eye out for is public sentiment. So I believe that the public does appreciate or will appreciate this greater oversight and this greater scrutiny. But I also believe that there is a point at which the public can also recognize political gridlock and can recognize extreme partisanship. And that constant feedback from the side of citizens and the minority being sensitive to that hopefully would ensure that these new changes doesn't become, an impediment, but rather something that facilitates and improves the way Parliament does business. The other point that I would add is hopefully both the minority and the majority, right, aside their partisan differences, would begin to recognize that there are some things that it is Ghana and Ghana's interest and serving the citizens that is at stake, and that then guides the building of consensus on important matters. Yes, parliamentary politics is such that parties would always want to score some political dividends over either support for legislation or opposition to a given legislation. But hopefully you can build the political culture to a point where on critical matters of national development, the guiding principle will always be what is in the best interest of the country, what is in the best interest of its citizens. And I think if we can do that, then the prospects will be bright as we see work being done in Parliament.
Let me come to you, Professor Dodu. When you look at all of these dynamics and the power play, as some put it, but Dr. Manteyao says, listen, they must go through the rigorous processes to ensure safeguards as well for our natural resources, for our flora and fauna. Your take on that is?
Well, I believe this is very important to the nation. I don't think either side are technically opposing the bill and opposing the need to extract. What I believe is that this back and forth will give us opportunity to dialogue more, to give us opportunity to rethink through carefully so that we come up with a well-tightened agreement. And I believe that both sides will see the benefit in having this deal come to the country in the best interest of us. For instance, in the core of this is capacity building that we need to even consider. So which I hope that during those discussions with experts and broader consultations that will be done, these will be taken care of so that we have the real benefits. For instance, if we are thinking about the capacity, the skilled labor to even go into the field of the mining of this resource, this is a special type of mineral that requires special type of extraction procedures. Even if we are going to use it for the benefit of the country in terms of the battery production, we even have the needed capacity to be able to do that. There's the skilled labor to do this, which I believe that we should also look at it from this perspective. I don't believe strongly that either parties will hijack for technically political score, gaining political points, but the national interest here should be one of our focal points. I believe, and I always say that the resource will not be the only benefit that we are going to get out of it. We might get some benefit out of it, but what do we actually get as a country? How do the citizenry benefit from this resource? Even if we're talking about the royalties or the percentages that are going to come, which we've had all those discussions going on, what percentage of that can go into, say, research, into the mining techniques, into empowering the people that are going to be in this sector and empowering the people that are going to work within the community? I like the angle that Dr. Mantea was talking about. What are the sustainability principles that are going to be put in place? How do we ensure that the environment is not adversely affected whilst we extract all these minerals? And the policies that have been associated with it in terms of whether this mineral will be extracted and everything leaving our country, which is a critical thing that we have to also think about, looking at what has already happened in the past. Are we extracting and taking the benefits of the country? Are we doing the beneficiation here? How are people going to benefit? I think that these are things that could go into such discussions and look at the national interest. And I believe strongly this will definitely be beneficial if we negotiate very well. We are well guided on the agreement to have the most out of it, especially for our country. We should look at it in a long-term manner, not in the short term that what are we going to benefit, what percentage are we getting out of it, but what is the future? What is the long-term plan that we put in place? I'm from academia, so I will be a little bit biased on the part that can go into this research, that can support these activities and support the bill so that we can all have the benefit of it. But I believe strongly that it is a good thing that we have to look at it holistically, including other minerals that we are going to even get out of it. It's only lithium that is just a small percentage of what will be mined. There are other components that we are not even talking about, which I believe that maybe when the discussions go on in Parliament and there are more scrutiny, we can look at the different values of, say, the feldspar, the kaolin, and all those aspects. If you're looking at just about 1.2%, that is the lithium oxide that we are going to get, and looking at that, that is not much. But what are the other components that are there that we can benefit from it as a country? So I think that holistically, this is good for the country, and we have to look at it in the best interest of the country, either sides.
Gentlemen, in a minute each, what would be your expectations going forward? Yes, we must cut the right deals. We must negotiate properly. We must ensure that we are getting the most out of this for our country. But there are also timelines when, in the dying embers of the 8th Parliament, Dr. Steve Manteyao, and to the rest of you, how quickly should this be done and how rigorous should the process be? Timelines, final words. Dr. Steve Manteyao, I'll start with you.
This actual is not a deal, really. It's an agreement has come to Parliament at, let's say, at the wrong time. This is an election season, and politicians are looking for money to finance their campaign. And so this deal, I'm 100% sure, will be passed and will pass quickly at a great cost to the company. And the attention may not go so much into the content as to whether we have a good deal or not, or whether the environmental and sustainability safeguards are added or not. We've seen this time and again when agreements of this nature come to Parliament a bit late, and the rush in which work is done. I mean, it goes through the processes of approval. And so on this occasion, given that we are in a political season, my belief is that it will be passed, but it will come at a cost to the company.
Thank you, Dr. Steve Manteyao. Let me take your concluding thoughts. Dr. John Osai-Kwapong.
As they say, I mean, if it must be done, then it must be done well, and it must be done right. And so hopefully the concerns that Dr. Manteyao raises about it being rushed, that may be with, with concerns raised from, the public, those in the civil society space. Hopefully it may get Parliament to be a little sensitive to that public sentiment, and hopefully, tame their desire to rush through this. Because again, you want to do it well and you want to do it right.
All right, and I'll wrap with you, Prof. Final words.
Well, I believe that it should be looked at carefully, even if we do it much quicker. It's already an agreement that is being signed, and Parliament has to do ratification. I think that we should look at it holistically, as I said, and look at the benefits that will be in there. If the agreement didn't capture some points, can we modify? Can we have some addendum that would be to the benefit of the citizenry, that would be to the benefit of the nation? But certainly, I think it's a good thing, the extraction.
Thank you, Prof. Thank you, gentlemen. Dr. Steve Manteyao is co-chair Ghana Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative. We also had Professor David Doduahin, Director, Institute of Applied Science and Technology at the University of Ghana. And on the other end, we had Dr. John Osai-Kwapong, a CDD Fellow. These have been our conversations from Parliament, looking at a swathe of issues: the LI on traffic, road transport, the bits about the shake-up in Parliament, and the positioning of the minority, among others, and now concluding with this lithium conversation. Do stay with us. We still have our Citizens microphone coming your way in a bit right here on the AM show. Do stay.